Good morning. We're just going to wait a few more moments here while Paul's warming up. All right, the room. This meeting, by the way, will be webcasts, so that's why I need Paul back here in order to get started. So look your best, everyone. Look your best. Okay, good morning. Welcome to Proposed Rule 1118.1, non-refinery flare regulation. This is our public workshop for this rule. This has been a long journey, but I think a fruitful one. This is a new rule, and we'll go into discussions about why this rule was formulated and how we're formulating it. This is also considered our CEQA scoping meeting. We'll have a slide on CEQA. Those who don't know, CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act. Because this project does require action, we are therefore required to evaluate any potential environmental impacts from taking such an action. Okay, a couple housekeeping. First off, my name is Mike Kraus, Planning and Rules Manager here at South Coast AQMD. Welcome to many familiar faces in our working group. Just a shout out to our working group. It's been a long journey for them too. I'm sure they love seeing my face every month. But they've been really a great group. They really did take to heart and rolling up their sleeves and getting deep into it. And everybody has contributed a lot and helped us formulate what I think is a good way forward. Okay. A couple things though, everyone's got their phones, let's get those on mute so we're not sort of interrupting or vibrate mode. If you do need to take a call, it's totally cool, no one's gonna take offense if you need to pop outside to finish that up. There are restrooms down the hallway if there's any emergencies, many ways to exit out of this particular room. Okay, again, this is being webcast. So someone who wasn't able to make it can actually archive that at a later point. As usual with our public workshops, staff will give a presentation, and then we'll open up the microphone for folks to come up and make any public comments they would like. Okay, yes, and one other thing here, because we are webcasting it, we do have an email address, so if anyone's out there and would like to send any questions to us for us to answer or provide any comments that you want us to read out to the workshop, we're more than happy to do that. We'll put this email address up periodically. It's akim, A-K-I-M, @aqmd.gov. Okay. I just saw myself on the big screen. Whoa, too much. Okay, so let's do some quick introductions, by the way, here at the table. So Steve, why don't you start us off and introduce yourself, please?
Good morning, Steve Zamora. I'm the rule writer for the 1118.1 proposed rule. And to my right.
Yeah.
I'm Heather Farr. I'm program supervisor working on this role.
I'm Barbara Radline, program supervisor, CEQA.
Bill Wong with General Counsel's Office.
Good morning, Shaw Devirian with the Socioeconomic AQMD.
Hi, Luke Eisenhart, Air Quality Specialist for CEQA, AQMD.
Great. All right. And today's workshop, just going to give you a quick little agenda. We'll be discussing the regulatory background, the actual rule development, the proposed rule itself, some key concerns that have been raised, most particularly recently, and our schedule. Okay, Steve. Barbara.
Yeah, so the one
Who's behind me? Heather is going to start us off with the regulatory background. Miss Heather.
Thank you, Michael. So good morning. Thank you all for coming. So currently, there is no source-specific rule for non-refinery flares. New flares are subject to BACT requirements. The first BACT determination was in 1988, so it's about 30 years ago. We had a 0.06 standard for minor and major sources. Since then, as technology improved and NOx emissions were reduced, we were able to lower those. This rule is looking to be a little bit more restrictive by requiring all minor and major sources to meet those lower standards. We do have some considerations when we're thinking about new minor sources. But since there is no current source-specific rule, the EPA does require us to have a rule if there's another jurisdiction that does, based on their RACM, BACM, or reasonable available control technology and best available control technology. And there are two counties, San Joaquin and Santa Barbara, that have limits on non-refinery flares. Therefore, we need to have a rule. We addressed this in the 2016 AQMP with our control measure CMB03, emission reductions for non-refinery flares. In addition, in the 2016 AQMP, we did have a control measure for reclaim facilities, and we do have about 19 facilities that have flares that are in the reclaim program. So this rule became a landing rule. So our rule development began actually last April 2017. It's been quite a long process. We've had a lot of participation from our stakeholders, and we do want to thank you. We've got a lot of feedback, a lot of changes to the rule, a lot of improvements. We have had altogether 8 working group meetings. In those working group meetings, we've had 4 presentations from alternative technologies. For instance, ClearSign came and gave a presentation. We had a presentation on compressing gas as opposed to flaring it. In addition, gas to liquid was also presented. In addition, we had 3 stakeholder presentations that occurred during our working group meetings. Staff also was able to go out to 20 different facilities. We went to landfills, wastewater, and oil and gas, and including a couple of other flaring, so that would be like truck racks. We didn't make it out to any marine terminals, but we did see some truck unloading and some tank degassing. Through this process, we had 3 different rule concepts. We started out with a proposal talking about the age of a flare. So we were proposing to replace older flares, but really the stakeholders' feedback was that even though it's an older flare, you might not be targeting, you might not be getting the most emission reduction. Some of those older flares, for example, might not be operating very often. So we moved on to that, and we took this concept that we adopted from the Bureau of Land Management, where they were encouraging beneficial use. So they would look at a facility and say that you can only have a certain amount of flaring. And we had an ambitious goal of getting to maybe 98% beneficial use. Well, the feedback we got from that proposal was that it was difficult to commit to the different beneficial use percentages. And we were told that we should really try to target that routine flaring. So a flare that's out there that's flaring 100% of the time, 24/7. So staff did go back and think about this idea of routine flaring and how could we identify what we considered routine flaring and try to reduce that. And that's how we got to the current proposal, which talks about capacity thresholds. So we want to get to the goals of 1118.1. Our primary goal, of course, is, as we mentioned, we're trying to minimize routine flaring, but we also want to maximize the amount of emission reductions we can achieve and encourage beneficial use. So how are we going about doing that with this proposal? Well, for the minimizing routine flaring, we're establishing a capacity threshold. If you flare above that threshold, then we're going to require you to take some action. When we were looking at these thresholds, we wanted to make sure we were maximizing the emission reductions. So we looked at a threshold that would give us the maximum amount of NOx reductions, but would still be cost effective. And for encouraging beneficial use, we're looking to allow longer time frames if you're going to reduce your flaring versus if you're going to replace that flare. So just the general approaches for 1118.1. We're going to have different provisions for new flares. New flares are going to have to meet emission limits consistent with what BACT is. And then for existing flares, at least existing flares that are flaring landfill gas, digester gas, or produced gas from oil and gas, or any gas that's being flared in an open flare, those flares are going to have a capacity threshold. The facilities will have 2 years to monitor their capacity threshold. And if after 2 consecutive years they're over that threshold, then they will be required to take action. The rule is designed to allow for compliance options. We are allowing these long time frames, and once you get to that, at the end of that 2 years, you have options. You can either replace that flare or you can try to reduce your throughput. As I mentioned, the different time frames. For flare reduction, we're allowing a 36-month time frame, and for flare replacement, it will be 12 months after the permit is issued, with potential extensions. And we did set different thresholds for the different source categories based on the different operational needs. With wastewater and landfill, there's a constant supply of gas. The gas cannot be turned off. That is not the same for oil and gas extraction, where production can be slowed down or stopped to reduce flaring. We did look at the different costs for the different source categories. We received a wide range of costs for the different flare replacements, and they were much higher for landfills and wastewater versus oil and gas. We also have different emissions for each category. So really the highest emissions came from the landfills. So it proved to be more cost effective to have a lower threshold for the landfills. Oil and gas production, those flares were less expensive, so we were able to set a lower threshold for those as well. And again, all of our thresholds in the concept had to be proved out to be cost effective. So I'm going to kick this over to Steve to go through our proposed rule language.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming here to the district to listen in on this workshop. Another thanks goes to those who invited us to their facilities. Early on in May, I was introduced to a landfill and had no idea what went into a landfill, so we were very well educated as far as what it took to make things happen. Landfills, wastewater treatment plants, oil and gas facilities, and also the other flaring. And so with that, I'll be going over the rule development process, and then I wanted to also thank those that participated in the meetings that we've had here at the district. I know that we had meetings throughout the year, and also we actually had some apple pie because we all have a slice in this project together. So essentially, we wanted to kind of go over how we came to some of the ruled language, and also to try to identify any areas that you still have concerns over or need a further clarification on. So with that, we'll be following on the slide, the structure of the proposed rule. We start off with the purpose, and then the purpose, I'm just going to read from the slide here, that is to reduce NOx and VOC emissions from flaring produced gas, digester gas, landfill gas, and other combustible gases or vapors, and to encourage alternatives to flaring. This rule would really like to promote the use of beneficial uses as according to the CMB03 and the Air Quality Management Plan. However, those sometimes are very costly. If we found that the cost of flaring is probably the easiest for most people, but we would like to see some beneficial uses wherever possible out there. Second item is the applicability. How does it affect you? And so if you have a Air Quality Management District permit on your air pollution control device, thank you, then you have a applicable device that's being used for the air pollution control, whether it be a flare some type of a VOC control device and/or other type of air pollution control device. Next slide. Some of the definitions that we've identified, and let me tell you, some of these definitions were hard to come by. We spent months determining what a flare was. And so what we came to some resolution on was that a flare is essentially having the waste gas go through the burner along with, if necessary, an assist gas. And so that was our main course of action as far as defining the flare universe, is those that had the waste gas going through a burner. Next slide, please. Some of the other definitions that we would like to focus on further are going to be how calculations are conducted in regards to what your annual throughput would be. We also wanted to take a look at what your flare capacity would be. And we also wanted to take a look at the capacity threshold based on your industry type. What we did was we took a look at the cost effectiveness of various types of flare technologies, took a look at what types of throughputs are going through using your annual emissions reports, and we also take a look at the permit applications that were submitted for the actual installation. Also, there may have been some permit conditions. Maybe you were limited to 200 hours of use per year. So those are some of the things that we took into consideration. Also, we also want to take a look at what your industry capacities were. Some industries have a very, very large, amounts of methane to deal with, such as maybe a landfill, and/or two, maybe they have large volumes of gases to deal with when they're doing exploration in the oil and gas industries. So we took a look at some of the volumes that companies were dealing with in addition. So getting into the key definitions for determining thresholds is we also identified the annual throughput. The annual throughput is essentially how much volume or how many BTU was used for that calendar year. And so at the end of a calendar year, you should have a total annual throughput of that flare. For the capacity, that's be your maximum capacity of your flare, and that's how much the flare was designed to be able to burn. And so we'd use that as your, essentially your denominator and identify how much throughout the year you used based on that total capacity. Your capacity threshold is going to be the amount you actually burned in that calendar year. And you want to take a look at in two fashions. You could either take a look at how much volume or million standard cubic feet used or burned at that time, or two, you could take a look at how many BTU was actually burned in that course of action over the calendar year. So we want to try to make sure that those thresholds are not exceeded for your specific industries. Next slide, please. So we have two tables that we're working with. One are for new flares, and so those are going to be based on new installations or relocated from one place to another. And the new flare is going to have certain provisions associated with it. They're based on the best available control technology that we have currently, and we also try to identify those up-and-coming thresholds for the new flare. The new flare would have certain permit conditions in addition to what the Rule 1118.1 would include, and so the permit writer would now be aware of the proposed rule language, and any new flare that comes across as an application would be taking a look at some of these emission limits. Next slide, please. So second, table two, it would essentially include your existing flare. Whatever you're using now is going to have to come into some compliance at least past 2 years. So the first year, you're getting all your equipment set up, you're getting your fuel meters installed, you're establishing certain limits. The second year is probably your first full calendar year of usage, and you'll be taking a look at what your annual threshold is. You want to take a look at whether you've exceeded or you have not met the threshold limits. And this will be at this point, you'll identify whether you need to reduce the amount of flare gas going to the flare, two, take a look at whether there's new flare technologies that you can incorporate, or three, establish beneficial uses to try to reduce the amount of flare gas going to the flare. So those are some of the thoughts that you might start considering. I know that a lot of people are already in the planning or thought process of how they're going to go through the flare analysis. But on the whole, you need to take a look at what your volume needs are. You need to take a look at what your capacities are. And you also take a look at what your future holds for you. If you're in a growing industry, maybe you may need to have some of the new flares to take up some of that burden from your existing flare capacities. And those are some of the things to take a look at. Some of the other items that may be coming into play is the price of oil. Oil in and of itself is what, $70 a barrel thereabouts. I know that in the gas pumps there seems to be a lot more costs associated with the barrel of oil. But if the barrel of oil starts going up, I would imagine that the oil and gas industry would start doing more exploration, more extraction as well. So those are some of the variables that occur when we take a look at some of the oil and gas industries. As far as wastewater, food diversion is happening on 1383, and so we may see more anaerobic digestion occurring in the field, and so that might be another addition that may need to be addressed in some fashion. As far as other flares are concerned, we found no really established technology to be able to replace what they're currently working with. Many of the new other flares are working at best available control technologies of what's available. I've taken a look at the clearinghouse information, and they're consistent with the clearinghouse information. And so at this point in time, if you have other flaring type of gases, it does not have a capacity threshold, if you'll notice from the Table 2 criteria here. Next slide, please. So we wanted to try to clarify better the information that we were talking about in regard to other flaring. So we made a modification to the language. And so in the language, we have an owner or operator of a flare or flare station is subject to the capacity thresholds in Table 2 and installed prior to the date of the adoption can demonstrate compliance with the emission limits in Table 1 or calculate the percent capacities. And so we hope that that would clarify some of the language and then hopefully identify some of the other flaring not being covered under this provision of Table 2. Next slide, please. If you do decide to do beneficial uses, we realize that that's going to take a lot more planning on your parts, but also too, there might be some design issues to deal with. And so you're allowed additional time beyond what was established for installing a flare to be able to establish your beneficial uses. In this example, or pictured here, we have a landfill with a electricity or electrical generating facility identified. That electrical generating facility uses a lot of the landfill gas to be able to run turbines, run microturbines, and so that would be considered a beneficial use. And with that, they may require additional time in siting. Maybe you to take a look at some of the rates, some of the surcharges, some of the various revenue sources that you may be able to achieve based on this type of energy. This is considered a green energy. I've been to some of the landfills that they have a higher markup for that type of energy because the companies want to see green energy as part of their portfolio, and so there may be some incentives associated with these beneficial uses. Next slide. Source testing. The only way that we can verify if you're using the flare at a minimum level of NOx emissions is to do a source test. And so if you've done source tests that have been approved in the past, within the past 5 years, we're going to allow that information to be used to be able to base it on that data. You'll be maintaining those source tests for 5 years, and also you'll want to make sure that the source tests includes the parameters that we're looking for, basically NOx emissions, carbon monoxide, VOCs. So I understand there are some incinerators that are out there that have not been doing NOx testing. So if there are needs to do NOx testing, that might have to be upgraded for source testing if you are required or if you're above the threshold. Some of the other requirements for source testing, you need to have a fuel meter. Some fuel meters cost more than others, and so we did not require a certain type of fuel meter, only that it be non-resettable. Initially, we started off with an ultrasonic fuel meter, which we were told by our stakeholders that that was something that was pretty much cost prohibitive. We've kind of gone away from that, and now we're taking a look at fuel meters that would be approved by your permit engineer. And so those are some of the elements that we looked at in regard to the source testing. All our stakeholders gave us great input. In fact, some of our sources of information came from stakeholders, and we try to incorporate where we can applicable provisions within their own industries. And so thank you very much again for that information from all our stakeholders. Next slide, please. Monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements are going to be provisions of this proposed rule. Essentially, we want to be able to identify what your threshold capacity is. We want to make sure that you've stayed below the threshold capacity after the first 2 years. We also want to make sure that there were notifications made if there were any surpassing of the threshold capacities. Some of the threshold capacities could be calculated in a couple of ways. One is going based on your flow. Another way is going to be based on BTU content. And so either way is perfectly acceptable. For one of the cities, I did a calculation, and using a set BTU, we were within less than 1% difference between the two, so they're pretty consistent either way you calculate it. So it'll be dependent on what your capabilities are. If you know your BTU content, that's great, you could plug that in. If you don't know your BTU content, but you forgot your flow from your fuel meter, then you could use that information. So either way is perfectly acceptable, whatever's easier for you, and so you may want to do some calculations to see what's easier for your company or for your industry. Some of the things that we need to clarify on is the definition. So we're planning on having some clarifications made to the heating value of the flare gas. And so that would hopefully clarify some of the language. And so in this slide here, we want to show you where we plan on making some changes. We wanted to show that those highlighted in yellow would be the changes made to the language. And so we'll say that the heating value of the flare gas shall be measured and recorded at least once per month. There'll be a recording. You would have it on a sheet of paper or calculated or available on your computer, and recorded by measuring the methane concentration, and weekly with a portable non-dispersive infrared detector calibrated for manufacturer specification. This was from our, I think, working group 8. We received input from a person who actually goes to landfills on a routine basis, does the methane monitoring, and provided this information to us. And we felt that this was a reasonable approach considering what the cost of analysis might be over a year period of time. And so we were including this data thanks to the stakeholder. Next slide, please. This is the one that people like the most, are the exemptions. And so we want to try to make sure that we discuss some of the exemptions that we've identified. Of course, those rules under 1118, 1147, and 1109.1 would not be covered because they're already covered in those specific rules. If you don't know, 1118 is for refinery flares, 1147 is for natural gas types of miscellaneous devices, and 1109.1 are for refinery and other industries that are under reclaim. And so we've identified those as other rules that they'll be covering their units specifically. Also, another exemption are landfills that generate less than 2,000 million standard cubic feet and cease accepting waste. We did identify a situation where they were actually closed but still accepting inert waste, and so we plan on looking at some language that might be able to accommodate them in that fashion. Various location flares that might be used in the oil fields or in certain wastewater plants are going to be exempted as long as they stay within the district requirements for various location permits. Low emitting flares of less than 30 pounds per NOx per month are exempted, in addition to those flares used for less than 200 hours per year. And so that's already provided for in some of the permits that I've seen out there, and so we would like to continue that on with this proposed rule. Next slide. And I believe, you got it, Michael Krause, our manager.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, let's put for those on the webcasting, we've got the address again to submit any comments, akim@aqmd.gov. Again, it could be comments, could be questions. It's all good. Okay, all right. Thank you, Paul. As Steve noted, throughout the presentation, you'll see that sometimes we have that wording in white and sometimes in yellow. The reason for that is the white was basically to outline what we had in our preliminary draft. The yellow are some recent changes, so not in the current preliminary draft rule that we now have posted online, but rather changes that we've made just recently in response to comments that we've received. So I wanted to highlight that, and then highlight a couple other things that we're working on with the rule. As anybody who's been involved in a rulemaking process, you know, it is an evolving process. It can be very exciting, can be very daunting, all those things, but we keep wanting to take in this feedback, and we keep wanting to, get it to the end. And looking good. Okay, so one of the things we wanted to note was that in that table 1, these are the emission limits for anybody who's got a new flare, replacing a flare. Those limits are as Heather noted, the BACS limits. They happen to be BACS limits currently for our major sources, not necessarily minor sources. Major, minor, by the way, that's established by the U.S. EPA. These are sources, for EPA. They're very concerned about major sources. That's how their rules and regs are basically dominated by. And that's a 10-ton per year threshold, 55 pounds a day when it comes to NOx and VOCs. In case anybody is up on CEQA, that's how we established our significance thresholds under CEQA. Anyhow, but because we're in an area of extreme non-attainment, we care more than just about large sources. We have to get right down even to the minor sources. So we look at them as well, and we also create, again, standards or emission levels that we seek from those sources. But in this particular rule, we thought it's really important, again, to kind of, if there's technologies out there, technologies that can be used, we have seen it in these smaller sources, being able to use cleaner technology out there. We wanted to also push for that within this rule. However, some folks were concerned that if you could be a minor source, you could also be doing very minor activity, and that the cost or even the feasibility sometimes on some of those newer, cleaner technologies isn't panning out for those particular sources. So, so the idea here is or the concern that was raised was to allow installation of any new flares at that minor source-backed level, particularly in the wastewater treatment arena. So that's what was being raised there. So we are considering maybe adding that allowance in there. However, we want to make sure that it's living up to what the expectations are, which is not used very often. That this is something that some people argue would be considered their backup and what have you, but how do you define it? So we're working on that, and we're looking at ways that we can possibly have that allowance, but add in there some kind of restrictive boundary for that. And so those that would not be normally using it, a lot, or those that normally would be using it a lot, would kind of fall under the original goal of the rule, which is routine flaring. Then the other issue that was raised was, what about landfills that actually collect some kind of waste that don't actually emit any of these landfill gases, something that we're trying to target? So that makes sense. So, it seems that when we look this up, CalRecycle has these different types of sites, these landfill sites that just collect what they call inert. There's like tires and things like that, as well as asbestos onto those sites. So again, not really generating the landfill gas that we were targeting. So we're looking at ways that we can kind of include that, maybe fold that into our current exemption for those landfills not collecting waste. Okay, let's see. Next up. Someone raised an interesting question. It's about thresholds. So when we write rules and regulations, we write them and we look at the universe, the affected universe as a whole, and we look at the cost effectiveness of the rule as a whole. That's what our directive has always been here at this agency. But sometimes, of course, you can get down to the nitty-gritty and actually start looking at how individual affected facilities are. And we were cognizant of this at the beginning of this rulemaking, which is why when we started looking at the different affected industries, we actually did start compartmentalizing them and viewing them for their different challenges and operational constraints that Heather mentioned earlier. And so we also crafted, as we noted earlier, the capacity thresholds being cognizant of that burden, of that fiscal burden, of that cost effectiveness level for each one of those, which is why you have different capacity thresholds. But someone had actually raised, well, what if you actually take my individual focus facility? Well, we don't really get down to those kind of levels when it comes to passing a rule or regulation. There's the old phrase, some winners, some losers kind of thing in a reg. We want we want to have good, cleaner air. We want to be able to craft rules that are going to be workable for these industries. We do believe that there are other options. The cost-effective value that was being raised was one strictly based upon going to this cleaner flare, but there are other options again out there. We have, as noted earlier, a number of site visits out there, and we've learned a lot. And it's really fascinating. Some really great stories out there. Facilities that are just saving hundreds of thousands of dollars by making smart choices now on things like beneficially using that gas that they're needing to handle, and it can be a win-win approach. So we really want to encourage that. And we've also tried to build in long-term planning. That was something that was raised, something that people said, look, we want to do beneficial use, but we're not gonna be able to do it in 1 year, you know? We need that time to be able to make that proper planning and do something in a long run. And we're cognizant of that, and we want to provide that long-term planning for folks. And then finally, someone mentioned about when it comes to oil and gas, it's a little different than some of the other facilities. Again, as Heather mentioned, you've got ongoing gas handling issues for the landfills and wastewater treatments. But when it comes to the oil and gas, they have a little more flexibility, a little bit more ability to kind of shut down, reduce production, do whatever, you know, and make some of those plans that they need to make. The concern was, well, you know, those are the same types of facilities that could be doing beneficial use. Be able, you know, look at getting that industry to be more focused on that goal. We think we felt like we built that in by providing a very low capacity threshold. That did kind of work out also along with their cost-effective values, but we feel that's more of that, you know, that driving force. But we are kind of taking another look at that to see if there's other areas by which we can incentivize those facilities to do more beneficial. Now, what you've all been waiting for, the CEQA analysis. Okay, so under the California Environmental Quality Act, again, that requires us to look at potential impacts from a particular project. This project is subject to CEQA. We are preparing currently a 30-day draft environmental assessment. The conclusion so far is that there's no significant impacts from actually implementing this. It's probably due to the fact that if you look to see the number of actual facilities being impacted and the long compliance schedule, that just means that statistically to have the likelihood of something actually all happening on one given day is very highly unlikely. Because of no significant impacts, there will be no requirements necessary for a scoping CEQA meeting, although we did open this up as one. We didn't want to necessarily close the door for any sort of input that folks may have. Alternatives analysis or coming out with any, quote, feasible mitigation measures would not be required as a result of having a project that's already considered not significant. Under the environmental assessment, you'll see that we're evaluating 17 environmental topic areas. We'll release that for a 30-day review period, and any comments that we may receive on that assessment will be included in our final EA. With regards to our schedule, of course, we've been having these ongoing meetings. We did release the preliminary draft staff report and rule back on September 21st. Again, we've been taking in comments on that. You see the yellow lines, our key concerns that we're still focused on right now. Comments are officially due on October 31st. I say officially, but you know, technically people can make comments all the way up to the board date. But these will allow us to actually be able to incorporate comments into our next release of that, which you can see a couple bullets down will be November 6th. Okay, we'll be releasing the CEQA document. We're estimating around October 26th. That gives us 1 month out there for the public review. Be a set hearing. Always our set hearings, usually typically a month or 60 days before the public hearing. Kind of gives the board, our governing board, heads up that this rule is coming and allows them to start preparing for that final decision making come December 7th. Okay, with that, we're going to open it up to public comments. Why don't we take another look for those on the webcast, if you want to submit any comments to AKIM, A-K-I-M, at aqmd.gov. We'll either read off your comment or answer any questions. Okay, so we're just going to do open mic here. So anybody who wants to come up and speak first, feel free.
Good morning. I'm David Rothbart, representing the Southern California Alliance of Publicly Owned Treatment Works, or SCAP for short. First, I want to thank staff for working with us. It's been a long road, and we may not agree on every issue, but we certainly appreciate you working with us and trying to accommodate our concerns. A couple questions for you. One, Mike, you said that there'd be another version of the rule, or just the, I'm just wondering if there's another version of the rule that's on the horizon, because there's some inconsistencies in the current version. I'm curious if you're addressing that. For example, saying a non-resettable totalizer is inconsistent in the rule right now. I was curious if you're addressing that already.
Right, yes. So, like we noted, that we did release the preliminary draft rule on September 21st. Since then, we have added new language, modified, et cetera. You're right, the handheld meter. There was also, yeah, they're showing me the number of little things, the high heating value that Steve noted earlier, a couple other things that, again, we highlighted in the yellow, and that will be in that next version.
So there's going to be a new version of the rule available, you said like end of October?
Right, well, our thinking right now was that we would wait because we have the comment period till the 31st, see if there's any more before we release the next
Understood.
version.
But if you do have comments, or you notice that there's something that doesn't make sense, or there's a certain provision, send the comments in so we can make sure that we capture that. So we may not know something that you've identified, so let us know.
Sure. Comment and another question after the comment. On the, I think it's the third slide, talking about the regulatory background, there's a comment about there's 2 existing California air districts that adopted rules. And I think, Heather, you said with limits in it. Which rules would that have limits, numeric limits on emissions for biogas flares?
Right, so San Joaquin and Santa Barbara both have existing non-refinery flare, well, actually, flare rules. One does kind of allow folks to submit a plan, and I believe it's Santa Barbara is the one that actually has like a limit.
Yeah,
that
Santa
they have
Barbara
in
is
this.
for flares and thermal oxidizers. San Joaquin is for
Right.
all flares, including refinery flares.
And correct me if I'm wrong, there is no current numeric emission limit for biogas flares at the moment. That's my read of those rules.
Yeah, we didn't look into that one.
Okay, thank you. And not that it's a big deal, but one thing as far as presenting to the board as far as what BACT has been, when we talk about the 0.025 back level for major sources, that was something that was just, the determination for that was just processed through the BACT Scientific Review Committee a few months ago. So as far as the timeline, although I think for permitting, that's correct, but as far as formalizing that, that's not necessarily something that's happened until recently.
Okay, thank you.
And last question really is on the low use, not low use, on the minor source provision that you're talking about as far as considering allowing the 0.06 level for minor sources, for new minor sources.
Yes.
Did you have any language that you're working on? Is that something you want to continue discussing with us? I know you'd had to ask for us, and I kind of gave our association's response, which wasn't exactly what you wanted, but it'd be nice to continue the dialogue.
Sure, and like our discussion that we had on that particular point, we even discussed the idea that in allowing someone to install something new that was at a higher level, that, it's pretty obvious that someone could just say, if we do it based on a capacity amount, someone just could get something really large and, in order to like meet a capacity level, which would be different than an existing, source. So our thinking then was, I think you and I discussed flow rates, but then it's like, where do you go from there? But another idea is just time, right? So it could just be the number of hours, because I believe that we had also a discussion about that, Someone just needs it for that backup timing, right? So, now we're just sort of trying to formulate that. One thought might be is that if we, similar to a capacity threshold, you could equate that onto an amount of time. So hours per year, similar to what you would have for the exemption, you just have another time threshold.
Okay, maybe we could continue discussing that. And along those lines,
Sure.
I didn't see anything in the document or the CEQA analysis as far as, I know it came to me a very late notice as far as the potential impact of food waste being diverted to digesters per 1383. Thermophilic digestion is something that came to our attention. That's something that could increase ammonia levels in digester gas, and that could be something that can be problematic. Is there,
Right.
do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
So keep in mind that, CEQA evaluates the impacts from this project. Those impacts that you're referring to are things that were gonna happen regardless of this project, right? So we don't take, CEQA won't take ownership of those impacts. in the document, okay? You mentioned
As
CEQA.
far as the rule itself, is that something you've looked at in any greater detail as far as the challenges that may pose, since we don't have a lot of answers pertaining to what impact that would be by loading up food waste?
Right, so, like we discussed, I mean, that does seem like that's a challenge for the industry, I don't disagree. However, in looking at that, it's actually more of a challenge for us, because if that research is true about the increased ammonia, then we're talking about increased NOx, which really kind of drives even more the need to have us continue searching out ways to regulate that, but within a context that works for the industry.
Okay, just something I just wanted to bring to your attention. It's something that the wastewater industry is very concerned about, and concerned setting a rule at a level that we don't know if we can comply with is something we're all very concerned about.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, I saw someone get up, but I thought they were heading toward the microphone. Steve.
Hello, Steve Jepson, Executive Director for the Southern California Alliance of Publicly Owned Treatment Works. Thank you. I want to echo David Rothbart's comments about how we've really enjoyed working with the rule development team. You guys have been great to work with and mostly listening to us, so thank you for that. We are still a little bit concerned that the wastewater, being such a minor source, is being regulated to such strict limits. However, we understand your goals and needs. Definitely want to reiterate the concerns with food waste diversion and the wastewater industry throughout the state support of food waste diversion to digesters and the still unknown effects that food waste diversion and thermophilic digestion may have on ammonia and NOx emissions. And we are hoping that there will be adequate language in the rule to provide comfort to us that we should continue to help the state with food waste diversions. Also, you've heard me talk about this before. We still have some concerns with the timeline. 12-month for replacement is still optimistic for public works contracting. It does take time with contracts and bidding, et cetera. And 36-month time frame for a flare reduction project is also optimistic. Agreed, it's much longer than 12 months for the replacement. But these types of projects can have multiple stakeholders, multiple funding sources, different permitting entities, and it really can take some time. We see that you're providing a potential 12-month extensions, which is encouraging. We would welcome the opportunity to work with staff to develop some language for what the qualifiers would be for those extensions, so we could have some comfort with that. And that's all my comments for today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I'm going to try to address some of these things. So, right, so with regards to the strict limits, I mean, for us, we felt that actually once we started looking at the wastewater industry and providing the 70% carrying capacity to define those as routine flaring, felt that you guys have actually some kind of built in currently with the rule of the flexibility. But like with anything, we live in a dynamic world, and things are constantly changing, and if things are gonna, I mean, we ourselves may find ourselves needing to address this, this potential increase of NOx emissions and have to go back in and be more stringent in some areas. So we're not quite sure, where that will eventually fall, but I do think we need to continue keeping the dialogue going, and we can always go back and readdress if this becomes adverse. We just realized we did do the typo in the slide of the 12 months. We were proposing to extend that out to 18 in response to that issue. And with regards to flare, like any flare reduction plans, I mean, from our vision, you need to have some kind of time limits on any project, right? You guys work on projects every day in the world that you work in, and you set up time limits. You set up time limits for your consultants and your own teams and what have you as management out there. And it's like, we feel the same kind of way, that if a facility chooses to do something good and beneficial, we've got to set somebody on a time limit to kind of to work and make that happen and make that reasonable as we're trying to achieve these air quality goals. For us, we feel, we work on projects all the time. People come in and talk about their beneficial projects, and they talk about their timelines. They even hold us to timelines, because we will be typically the lead agency in evaluating CEQA, and they're constantly calling, what are you doing with that? So again, everybody's just on some kind of timelines. We did try to build in those extensions. We don't try not to be restrictive on the extensions, because we recognize that everybody's story is a little different, right? You have some people that have to report to boards, and that board may be causing the need for an extension or a delay in your project or funding or sponsors, what have you. Could be technology driven. There could be a number of factors by which someone needs that extension. We're very open to that, and we do we have provided extensions in the past. There's two, when we talk about extensions for any of these choices, engineering will handle what would be the flare replacement, because the application will be with the engineering department. But when it comes to the actual, like a flare reduction or a beneficial use type plan, that'll be discussed then in the planning department. So. And I think it's important when we sit down right from the beginning, like in any project, set realistic deadlines up, increments of progress, and how we can, make it work within the time frame. So we kind of do need a time frame in the rule. We were hoping that would be something that would work best. And again, we're still talking about after 2 years, right, of making a determination that your flaring is turning into something routine and not just like a fluke in process. Okay. Yes. Either microphone.
Good morning. I'm Chuck Helgett with Republic Services. Obviously, I have a couple of questions, comments regarding the landfill section of the regulations. And first of all, again, express appreciation for the lengthy preliminary process in developing these regulations. It was a very iterative process and interesting, as I said earlier. My first question relates solely to the cost effectiveness study. And this is just raising a question more than an issue, but you're using a 25-year life cycle or expectancy for the flares. And from Republic's perspective, we typically budget for a 15-year life cycle on our flares. So just a question about why the 25 years and what that was based on. Secondly, the question of beneficial reuse has popped up. The staff report discusses the option of achieving flare compliance through throughput reduction. And the staff report at least pretty clearly implies that throughput reduction will be achieved by a beneficial reuse plan of a project that could include gas recovery, such as energy production, transportation fuels, or renewable natural gas. We are very interested in moving forward on renewable natural gas projects, but I guess a reminder that we still have a significant hurdle on siloxane standards that really at this point in time have these projects stalled completely. So it's not for lack of interest. We're trying. But what it appears to me in the rule is when you read the language of the rule, there's no real specific language that would direct us towards beneficial reuse projects. I see it pretty clearly in the staff report, but I don't see it very clearly in the rule language. And this hinges then on my next question, is once you've exceeded the threshold 2 years in a row, excuse me, if you choose to do flare replacement, that would be one option. But on the beneficial reuse side, are we talking about new projects, or could we be rerouting gas towards an existing project? And so the ability to have that flexibility, I'm not seeing it in the rule right now, but I would assume that would be something that we certainly could do. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Okay, I'll take your last one first here. So yes, we remember that the rule is just looking at that threshold level. And that's what really, all that folks would be subject to. So therefore, anything above that, yes, you could use something that is an existing beneficial use project, a new beneficial use project, et cetera. So we're open to that. The idea is you just kind of stay below that, that threshold. So that's why you don't actually see specific language. Early on in the process, one of our proposals had been beneficial use target goals for folks. But that didn't go over very well. So felt a little too confined. And also the concern was like, well, while we may be aiming to get that beneficial use at 85% or something like that, what happens if we don't make it after our, first year or something? So there became a lot of questions of enforceability and where you go. But again, we're open to all of these. Again, we sort of try to build in a time frame to allow proper planning for these types of projects to happen, and again, added on extension at the end. With regards to something like the flare life, so that was another one of the proposals that we originally came up with about the age of these flares. And we found, if you go to look back at some of our early working group meetings, we actually plot the ages of these flares, and you'll see how you have a lot on the older end. So for us, having a 25-year life seemed to be a more reasonable, especially when flares are very simple mechanisms, and they don't tend to have a lot of complicated elements that, has a shorter life or breakdown period. So, it seemed that the 25 years, fell into a reasonable life of these flares. Ms. Kathy.
Thank you. I'm Kathy Obergfell from R.E. Nichols Engineering. I'm representing some of the oil and gas companies that are being included in this rule under other flaring. I'd like to also say thank you for all your consideration as far as the rule writing goes. One concern that we still have about the new rule is the other flare limits that have been shown for new equipment. As noted earlier, there isn't, the other flare category covers a wide range of applications. Many of these applications currently have different back standards. The back standard that is currently being shown in the rule is specific to marine loading, which is very different from truck rack loading, from tank degassing, from tank refilling. So there's a lot of different back standards out there for the different applications that could be covered by other flaring, and we think that either more clarification on other flare gas needs to be made, or a note that if a achievable back standard is different than what is shown, that it can be used instead of. Because one of the issues this particular standard will also have happen is in applications currently that now do not need to use a sysgas to flare their process gas, they will with low NOx systems. The only low NOx systems that are out there that can be used in these processes, the NOx Star and the CEB units, both require a sysgas for stabilization of their premix. And in many cases, the premix, a sysgas can be upwards of 40% by volume, the process volume going through. So if we have to add that volume of gas, we are actually creating large amounts of CO and CO2 that would have never been required in the first place. So we want to make sure that the current back standards take that into account, because in many places it's based on pounds per 1,000 gallons of gasoline loaded. And so if we're burning tons of sysgas, it goes against our pounds per 1,000 gallons. Whereas this particular standard is only looking at ppm, and it's also looking at 3% oxygen when most of our systems run between 12 and 15%. So it's the technology right now we don't believe is to the point that it's applicable for many of the applications, and would just encourage that the back standard actually be considered for those applications. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kathy. Hello, Susan. I say it's so cold. Keeping everyone awake.
Yes, Susan Stark with Marathon.
Good morning.
And I just want to say I agree with Kathy's testimony. I think that's important. And if we're not able to follow her recommendation of using back standards for the new flares under other flare gas, I would request if you could share any source or reference materials that show how that standard could be applied or has been demonstrated for those other categories, because we have some of those other categories. So, thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Susan. Bridget. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Bridget McCann, Manager, Technical and Regulatory Affairs for Western States Petroleum Association. WISP appreciates your consideration of all our verbal comments so far at the working group meetings, and we have submitted written comments to the district, and we're happy to discuss any of those in detail moving forward with the staff. So, thank you.
Okay. Yes, we did get your written comments. Thank you much. And we're going them through like checklist. Okay. Any other comments? Is the cold weather kind of freezing new ideas, or? All right, well, great. We really appreciate everyone coming here today and submitting your verbal comments. Again, written comments or emails, anything still available. Maybe we just pop over to Angela to see if we had anything via the email. Okay, so I guess we satisfied everyone on our webcast. All right, thank you again, everybody, and have a good day.